All right.
Ooh.
Welcome to another episode of Biblical Encouragement from across the pond. I'm DJ with HomeGrown Ministries, joined by my friend Glenn, the watchman on the wall. Today, we're going to address a question that Glenn actually received recently, and it's about where did Cain get his wife? Really interesting question, really interesting topic in my mind. So we're going to try to cover that as thoroughly as possible. But if there is something we miss in the conversation today, let us know down in the comments below, and we're happy to readdress the question at another time. But Glenn, over to you. What do you think? Where did Cain get his wife?
Um, I suppose I come from a non-believer or someone who doesn't know. So I would say Cain, well, it would have to be a close family member, to my knowledge. That's what I suppose I would go with. I suppose that's what a lot of people would say. Well, it had to be a sister or it had to be someone like that. So I say I'm coming from the non-believer or someone who doesn't know much about it. I'm coming from their point of view today, and I'm addressing this towards yourself. Um, so most people would be like, well, it had to be a family member, some sort. So I think that's where his wife came from.
Okay, so I agree with
Your
that
take on it?
for sure.
Yep.
So Cain's definitely married a sister. He would have had to have married a sister. So I think oftentimes this question is asked for one of two reasons. The first reason is they think that no one else existed at the time aside from Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Or the other reason is because they're trying to approach the moral standpoint and saying, well, it wouldn't be right for him to marry his sister. We have laws against that today, so that's just gross. So let's address the second part first. If it's a morality issue with you and you don't believe in God and you believe in evolution, then you have to believe that at some point somebody slept with a sister, right? Because evolution would dictate that that wouldn't matter. In order to get to where we're at today, there had to at least be only two sexes essentially that had children, and they would have been related in some fashion. So if you're coming from an evolution perspective, then from that point of view, there's really no issue there because you believe that at some point the human race was marrying their sister or their niece or something along those lines. But in addition, as I always say, if you're coming from the evolution standpoint, without God, there is no morality at all. There's only my opinion versus your opinion, so it's not wrong without God. Now, we can actually see in the biblical account that Cain did marry his sister, or we can make that assumption, I should say. And there's two reasons for that. So the first reason is we know that there were more people around than just Cain, Abel, Adam, and Eve from the account of Genesis 4:16. So Genesis 4:16 is telling you that after the events of Cain and Abel, it says, so Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Then all the rest of those verses are about Cain's descendants, essentially. And then picking back up at verse 25, it goes, okay, but we're not going to talk about Cain. We're really focused on Seth and his descendants. So during this time, Adam had other descendants. That's reinforced in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, where it says, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. So Adam lived a total of 930 years. He had a bunch of kids. At some point in this story, after Cain kills Abel, he obviously marries a sister or maybe a niece in order to continue his family line. There were no other options. He couldn't have married a cousin because Adam didn't have any brothers or sisters himself, so he would have had to marry a niece or some other person like that, one of the daughters of Adam, so one of his sisters he would have had to marry. Now, interestingly enough, in the Bible, the prohibition against marrying your sister doesn't even come about until Leviticus chapter 18, verse 9, which is hundreds of years after the Genesis account. So again, it wasn't wrong for Cain to do that at the time. He didn't have any other choices, so he would have had to have married a sister. What do you think about that, Glenn? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. I mean, you can't sort of pick the pieces out, as some people do, and say, right, well, that's just gross. That's just people, if they want to go down the evolution sense, it still makes sense as such. But they had to reproduce some way. You
For
know what I
sure.
mean? Um, you have a where you know they had to multiply, or else the human race was going to die out. Do you know what I mean? That's just it in a nutshell.
Which again is a
But
true on the evolution side too, right? It's true whether you believe God exists or doesn't. At some point in our
yeah,
history, somebody would have had to sleep with his sister, essentially.
yeah, or the human race would have just went extinct. You know what I mean? It's just, I suppose, but nowadays there's absolutely no need for that there because the world's overpopulated. I think.
Now, what's
Obviously,
interesting though is if you're freaked out about Cain marrying his sister, I'm just going to speak from a United States perspective because most people don't know this, and I always think it's interesting when we talk about this topic. Did you know marrying a relative is only illegal in 25 of the 50 United States? So, to throw this out there, 0.2% of Americans are married to a first or second cousin. Now, 0.2% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you do the math, that's 250,000 people in the United States of America that are married to a first or a second cousin legally. Interestingly enough, Albert Einstein married a first cousin. Jesse James married a first cousin. John Adams married a third cousin. So the first ban in the United States against marrying relatives didn't even come about until 1858. So although we may think that this is a weird thing of the past, this is something that's still happening. And outside of the United States, there's plenty of countries in Europe even where marrying a first and second cousin, marrying a sister even, isn't illegal. It's just not. So again, if you're weirded out from a marrying a relative standpoint, understand that that still occurs today. So if you are, again, a non believer and you're saying, hey, it's wrong to marry a relative, well, that's your opinion versus some of society's opinion who still thinks it's right. So who's to say, if you don't believe in God, that marrying a relative is wrong? We know it's now wrong because as of Leviticus, God set that standard that you can't marry a sister, right? So we have the ability to say God has said X, and God, being the creator of the universe, is able to establish rules. And so that's why we as Christians won't do that practice, but why society as a whole may not actually see a problem with it, right? Because without God, there is no moral standard. So that's my 2 cents, or about half a penny on that subject.
I didn't know that about the United States. So I didn't. That's actually quite like wow. you know, I so pretty much half the country's laws pretty much say it's still okay.
Correct.
Yeah. We actually over here in Northern Ireland or Ireland or this part of the world, as I say, you have the gypsies or the travelers or whatever whatever they want to call themselves these days. They would still marry their first cousins and their nieces and all that, so they'd all intermingle with each other. So what do you say? So that there still happens. You hear about it all the time. But that's actually it's actually quite interesting. So people are still talking like that as a past tense. It's still actually happening. But it's a very interesting topic at the same time. I mean, because people like to pick the pieces out and go, "Oh, that's just gross. That's not right." But God has sort of he has, like you said in Leviticus, he has said now, that's not right, and God's laws are absolute. It's it. Society, as they always does, try to change things to suit their own desires. It always has and it always will. But it has now been sort of reaffirmed in Leviticus that God said no, that's not acceptable anymore. It's not the way forward. So.
And again, I can't stress it enough. If you don't believe in God, then when someone says, hey, I want to marry my sister, you really have no ability to say, well, that's morally wrong. All you can say is, hey, I don't think you should. And maybe you could go one step further and say society doesn't think you should, even though we don't have the evidence for that currently. But that's as far as you could go. As a non-believer, you could never say that is morally wrong. All you can say is it's my opinion that it's wrong. We have no conclusive proof that it's actually wrong because morality doesn't exist without God. So I think that's a vitally important to remember when you're talking about this because I know typically when I've gotten asked this question, it wasn't from a believer. And I know a believer can ask this question, right? But typically it's from someone who doesn't believe and they're trying to do the gotcha, right? And it's like, okay, well, you
Yeah.
didn't, because without God, without morality, you can look right now, the rest of the world, there's tons of places where they think that's perfectly fine. And who are you to tell them that it's not if God doesn't exist? That's all I got. That's all I got. I'm out.
Uh, no, but that's actually perfect. So it is. Perfect explained. You know something? I couldn't have said it that way, to be honest with you, because I don't know the full ins and outs of it. You've clearly done your homework on it.
I just
I have.
Googled just a little bit.
Everybody Googles things nowadays. But no, I actually only knew bits and pieces of it, and I wasn't. It was a wee bit sketchy, I think. But the fact that half of the United States, like the laws itself says, well, 25 of the states, isn't it? You said
25 say it's illegal, which would mean 25 don't speak to it.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty crazy, like.
Yeah, and again, when you look at the numbers, it's not like a small portion of the population. It is a significant. I mean, 250,000 people is a significant amount of people that are still participating in some form of family marriage. Now, it's not going to be a direct sister or something along those lines, but you do hear of people marrying their half sister or their stepsister or their half brother or their stepbrother, and even that's banned in the book of Leviticus. So again, the Christian looking at God's law would say, okay, as of today, God has dictated that that is no longer acceptable. But in the very beginning, there were no other choices. So of course, God would have allowed that until a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
So, any other final thoughts, Glenn?
No, I think you have covered everything from a non-believer's perspective. Is more than anything I was going for with this conversation, because I think that as a believer, people generally understand that's just the way God intended things at the start. Whereas a person who doesn't believe in God would sort of try to wrap it around their head, and they're like, but I don't understand how that's it's allowed, but like you said, there was a reason for it at that time. There's not now. So
Yeah, and I think that that's the thing is oftentimes Christians, and this is why it's important to understand the response to these, we don't concern ourselves with this, and I would have never concerned myself with this question if an atheist hadn't asked me before. But it's good to understand the response, because God is a God of logic. I mean, he created logic, right? So he wants you to think logically. And the more you do that, the more you'll realize that the Bible is a logical text. Yeah, there's an aspect of faith to life, because there's things that we'll just never wrap our heads around, and we need to just have faith in God. But at the same time, God created logic. He wants you to use your brain, right?
yeah.
And so it's important to make sure you know the responses, because if you don't, these questions may shake your faith. And I never want that to happen to you. So I want you to be prepared with a reasonable defense for your logical faith. And I know some people get iffy when I say that, because they're like, well, faith should just be spiritual. And it's like, well, again, God created everything, including logic. So I think to honor and worship God, we need to be using the logic side of our brain as well as our faith side of our brain, if there is a such thing. Sure, the science fact checkers in there are down in the comments freaking out about the
Keyboard
faith
warrior.
side. There is no faith side of the brain.
Right. The keyboard warrior.
That's right. This is why I don't read the comments anymore. All right, Glenn, I just want to make sure we captured everything. Any final thoughts before I end today's video?
No. I would like to continue on this sort of topics. Just with a few more questions that other people have threw up at me. I think maybe if we could do another video at some point whenever we get around it, and maybe to do with the dinosaurs and stuff. If you're up for it.
Sure. So I think that's a great thing, is there's lots of questions out there. If you're somebody who's watching this video and maybe you're on the fence, you don't know whether or not God exists, and you have questions that you generally want the answers to. You're not somebody who's just trying to tear down a Christian. You're somebody who generally wants to know the answer, because it is something that's preventing you maybe from taking that leap of faith to use a weird term. Brain's not working at this point in the day. Leave a comment. Let us know your questions. I don't read them every day. I no longer have the app on my phone, so I don't see them as soon as they come across. But Glenn and I will read those comments at some point. And if you have a genuine question, we do want to address it. And same thing with the Christian. If you're a Christian, you're watching this video, and there's something that you just, were asked before and you don't understand, please ask, because again, we want to prepare you. We want you to be ready to have a response to defend your faith. As Peter reminds us, always be prepared. So I think that that's so vital. So if you have questions, whether it's about dinosaurs or about any other aspect of creation, or how anything really lines up, even if Glenn and I don't know it, we'll do the research, we'll Google a little bit, and
Yep.
we'll get you an answer that makes sense to us. Whether or not it makes sense to you, that'll be for you to decide. But all right, guys, I've yammered on enough. We're going to end today's video. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us. If you have questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts, like I said, let us know in the comments below. And Christian friends, please continue to be the salt of the earth, be the light to the world, and go encourage somebody else today. All glory to God, friends. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.